Hello everyone, I'm Maarten Coenjaerts from Lucas School of Arts Belgium, and together with my colleague Erika Valero Rodriguez from Lusofna University Portugal, we are inviting you to follow us through this walkthrough on the debate of artistic research. The concept of artistic research is a very complicated one, especially in terms of terminology. That's the reason why we want to start with this kind of terminological introduction, just to make sense of a few concepts and categories. In this sense, it's very useful, and it might be useful to borrow this distinction, which was introduced by Borgdorf, a Dutch scholar, who talks about three kinds of art research. A first type or category that he refers to as research on the arts, and that's a definition of art research in its most broadest sense. It assumes this kind of distance between the subject, the researcher, and then the main object of study, which in this case is, of course, art practice. And it's a definition which is commonly associated with the established academic humanities disciplines. I think, for example, of media studies, film studies, musicology, art history, and they all assume this distinction, this distance between the object and the subject. And for this reason, because of this distance, this approach or this definition is also called the interpretive perspective on art research. Another type that Borgdorf talks about is called research for the arts. And in contrast to the prior definition, here art research is more conceived as in a very narrow sense of the word. So here art is not so much the object of investigation, but its main objective. And the goal here is to provide insights and instruments which then in turn can be used into the field of art practice itself. And because the emphasis is on application, this perspective is also referred to as the instrumental perspective. In this walkthrough, when we are talking about art research, we are referring to the third concept that Borgdorf talks about, research in the arts. And here, contrast to research on the arts, it does not assume this separation between researcher, subject, and object of study. And so the distance is eliminated in this type of art research. And it's also called the performative perspective, because the artistic practice itself is an essential key component of both the research process and research results. The concept also comes in a lot of different disguises. Often you will find also the concept of practice-based research, or practice as research, practice-led research. We are using the concept of artistic research. That's a general term, and that's also the concept that we will be using throughout this walkthrough Miro board. This artistic research, then, if we try to come up with this kind of definition of artistic research, we can go and look through the literature. A lot of definitions and concepts have been provided by scholars. This is an overview of some of a selection of these kind of definitions. It will take us too far if we want to go too much in detail into these different conceptualizations. But I think if we want to pinpoint this kind of a red thread throughout the discussion of artistic research, I think the majority of this kind of scholars often refer to the fact that artistic research, for artistic practice to become an artistic research, the practice should become something more than just making an artwork. It has to be complemented with something more, and that's the research component, of course. and it has to deal with questions of what kind of questions do we want to research, what kind of methodology can we use to achieve an answer to that question. So the main fact or the main element here is that research should go beyond the intuitive and personal aspect of making an artwork. That also has to do, of course, with creating knowledge according to a set of values, principles, which are motivated by a common research methodology. So I think if this is in a nutshell the definition of artistic research, it also comes with a lot of questions and challenges. And in the next frame, that's something we want to delve into a little bit more. And we want to talk a little bit more about certain challenges that the Alliance has to deal with it. And that's for the next stage. So we just talked a little bit about the concept of artistic research. In this frame, we want to put our focus on the challenges that comes with the definition. It's a brief overview. I think one of the key issues or challenges of artistic research is of an ontological nature. What is the nature of the object, of the subject matter in research in the arts? To what does the research address itself, and in what respect does it thereby differ from other scholarly or scientific research activities? Another challenge is more of an epistemological nature. With what kind of knowledge and understanding does research in the arts concern itself, and how does that knowledge relate to more conventional forms of scholarly knowledge? We could distinguish some sub-questions within this issue, like what is art, what is knowledge, what is scientific knowledge. So it's a very complicated debate, but really a crucial one if we want to address the challenges of artistic research. A third one would be one of a methodological nature, through which kind of methods and techniques of investigation do reveal and articulate this kind of knowledge produced by artistic research. And this all has to do with defining the method of research. A fourth kind of challenge, also very complicated one, is the issue of reproducibility. How do we reproduce this kind of knowledge that is typical for artistic research? And here we also have to, I think, keep in mind the fact that the output or the outcome is not always a verbal form like in academic research. So then, of course, the problem or the challenge is how can we reproduce the kind of knowledge that is inherent connected to an artistic practice, which is not always of a verbal kind. Another challenge is the one that has to do with how to assess the kind of knowledge. When does a particular research qualify as research? And this challenge, of course, has to do with defining a formulated selection of evaluation criteria. How can we assess the knowledge produced by artistic research? And then lastly, we've got a more organizational, institutional question. How do we organize and structure research in the arts? Again, we can discriminate between some sub-questions. What is a research group, for instance? How do we define a research cluster? What are existing research structures for artistic research? What kind of principles can we use to cluster artistic research? And also the question, of course, of models for PhDs in the arts. So here we've got this brief overview and mapping of kind of challenges. It would take us a lot of more time and work to try to find answers to them, but it's really, I think, important to have this kind of beginning, this map from which we can start trying to answer these questions and challenges of artistic research. So we just talked a little bit about the challenges of artistic research, some of the key questions that we need to address if we want to develop our own research agenda. In addition, we were also fortunate to have the observations and some insights of experts in the field of artistic research. And we gathered these 6 experts on the topic of artistic research. One of them was Jyoti Mistry, professor at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden, and she was very keen on sharing some very vivid observations with us. One observation, for instance, was the fact that she stressed the rich historical tradition of artistic research, and then especially in with regard to film studies. And she emphasized, for instance, the notion of the filmmaker as a theorist. And of course, a figure like the Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein comes up as some important person, especially his montage theory, which is often referred to by other guest speakers as well. Another thing that she mentioned, besides the rich historical culture of artistic research in film studies, is the fact, and that's something that we already talked about previous, was the fact that artistic research should be more than just the art practice. Like she gave us the example of filmmaking. Like, for instance, filmmakers are doing research all the time. If you're making a film about the future, you're doing research to increase the authenticity. But as she pointed out, this is research for stories and not necessarily for epistemological purposes. So also, Jyoti stresses the importance of a methodological framework of formulating this kind of research question and inquiry, because that's the way in order to differentiate us of merely making art. As she put it, we have to make a sharp distinction between producing epistemological and aesthetic inquiry. Another thing that she mentioned was that film studies today is still very much in the business of literary criticism and not so much in the business of creating ideas. And she put the focus on the fact that films, you can use it also to comment and rewrite things. And she also stressed the possibility, for instance, of videographic essays, the fact that teaching or doing artistic research should go beyond the merely written medium. And like she also was keen to point out, you can use artistic research to rethink the methods of teaching. And yeah, also it's a little bit along the same lines as the things we already said before. What function does a creative project serve? We do not have enough people skilled enough to create the work creation. Often the evaluation of the film amounts to a film review. So she's also keen to pointing out that, and that connects to the assessment issue, of course, that in order to assess artistic research, we should also have people who are experienced not only in academic research, but also in reviewing works from more an aesthetic point of view. And also the aesthetic means to convey kind of knowledge and to produce knowledge, not only through the written medium. So that's, I think, nicely sums up some key observations of Jyoti Mistry. Another guest speaker was nice to share with us some observations on artistic research was Susana Helke. who is a professor at the University of Aalto, Finland. She was very keen with us to share some observations on the film lab, which she works in it. Like us, she started her talk with some general reflections on the theme of artistic research, like how does the theorizing or research conducted should differ from academic film studies, what kind of knowledge should we produce within the field of artistic research, to whom and to what purpose. So she also raised these questions which we of course already dealt with in the previous frame. Like Yotti, she also was keen to stress the historical tradition of doing research in the field of film practice, and she also refers to early cinema montage theory of Sergei Eisenstein, the idea of the filmmaker as a kind of theorist. In this case, then montage theory as being this innovation, this new kind of knowledge coming from within film practice itself. Then it was a very interesting talk about the more of kind of research structure of the film lab. It is structured around these kind of clusters, thematic clusters. For instance, we've got the critical cinema lab, which is a film practice-led and artistic research entity, which fuses theory and practice of filmmaking in order to catalyze new forms of cinema and new ways in which cinema can connect with audiences. Another cluster was more emphasized or was more clustered around the theme of screen poetics, which focuses on the screenwriting processes, variations in screenwriting, dramaturgy, and history of screenwriting. Another cluster was called Virtual Cinema Lab, which is a multidisciplinary arena for those interested in new and emerging technologies. Another research focus was on costume design. There was expanded scenography, which stresses the scenographic field of artistic research and filmmaking. Then there was a cluster around elements of success, which the focus here is not so much on the work itself, but more on the context, the production cultures, and the audiences of filmmaking practice. So it was very interesting to have this kind of set of examples of artistic research and the kind of themes that were being dealt with in the film school in Finland Aalto University. Then she went on to make this kind of distinction between two concepts. We already saw before that artistic research comes in various disguises, but it was interesting to hear from her that she makes this kind of distinction between practice-led research and artistic research, while the two often are used interchangeable. While talking about practice-led research, as she mentions, for instance, the fact that the knowledge which is produced is often of a very tacit and embodied bodily kind, contrast to the more academic written kind of knowledge outcome. When referring to artistic research, she also referred to the work of Henk Borgdorf, the role of the artwork thinking within art practice. And she also asked the question of where we should posit the artist within the artistic research methodology. And then we finished with this Q&A kind of session where she also raised a lot of questions and challenges, but also we asked her some questions and challenges. For instance, those labs, were they imposed top to bottom or bottom up labs? Because that's an interesting question if we want to address the issue of organization. How do we structure research, artistic research? And then she shared with us the fact that these clusters are bottom-up structures and that result from the convergence of interests. So it's more a network, a cluster network of researchers rather than these being strict entities. She also mentioned, I think, the theme of funding. It was also interesting to hear, for instance, that a lot of these persons who are doing artistic research are often doing it just in their spare time on the side as a hobby. And just the fact, because there is no internal funding anymore. So there is this minimal support for a couple of students. So it's definitely an issue and challenge that that the Alliance has to deal with it, the issue of funding, and how can we stimulate and motivate artistic research and students to do artistic research. How do we have to fund them?
Now we will share with you some of the insights regarding Stefan Gielen's presentation. Stefan is the Chief Executive of the Association Européenne des Conservatoires, Académie de Musique et Musikhochschule. And we had quite a prolific brainstorming. We started with key questions. What do you think artistic research means? How do you think that we can connect higher education activity with research? And Stefan gave us this background in terms of the past, when we had artistic performance on one side and artistic research, not practitioners, on the other. Moving forward, we have research carried by the practitioner. Breakthroughs came historically informed performance practice started in the 1960s. And the performance sector comes out with questions that can only be answered by academic research. These questions are different from the ones considered by those who are only theorists. Artistic research is another type of scientific research and needs to be taken into account. And then we have this notion, if there is not a research question in it, it is not artistic research. It's just someone performing innovative performance. And to the question that if collective or individual artistic research should be carried out, Stefan replied that Science Nobel Prize winners are always the head of a team, part of a collective. Why shouldn't artistic research be a collective effort? We should go beyond the idea of the genius of the 19th century. Then we have the following questions: how to get public recognition at the education and research level, how to obtain funding, how to obtain legitimization recognition. And in this regard, standards of higher education are very different across Europe. Certain types of research are recognized in one country and not in another. So the challenge of establishing new perspectives in artistic research. Examples: in Austria, there is a separate law for higher education institutions. They have the same funding and are considered at the same level as any comprehensive university. Whilst in Greece, a high-level, high-quality conservatoire in Athens, providing education in music, is not recognized, not allowed to deliver diplomas. If you do a bachelor's there, you can do a master's in London, but this will not be recognized by the Greek government. So you have this perspective that perhaps in Greece, visual artists are more recognized than musicians. This difference between countries are historic and mostly stem from the 19th century. And then we have the epistemological issue. What is research and what is special about artistic research when compared to other kinds of research? And the importance of the Frascati manual and these different paths: research on art, research through arts, research about arts. And it's in the research about arts that in terms of contemporary debate that we can find the point of conflict. And the important questions to overcome this conflict is how can traditional researchers and artists cooperate? How can we increase communication? And it's important to address this challenge because funding for traditional research is decreasing and being allocated to new forms of research. So the innovation that artistic research brings, it seems that is starting to be appreciated and validated. So where do you draw the lines between artistic research and artistic expressions? How do we meet the criteria? Artistic expression not being itself an act of research, if not transferable or replicable. And then we have these three examples: the score, composing, writing on paper, the performance, the creative process. Everything can be artistic research, but not necessarily. And as counterexamples, for instance, a musician is innovative based on his her very personal experience, and therefore this is not transferable to someone else. And there are people who are excellent performers but are unable to teach, practitioners who are not able to reflect on what they do. So we have the fact that transferability and reproducibility are more difficult to define in artistic research. To aim at transferability is essential, something that can be used by someone else in a systematic way. So another important notion is that the PhD has in many countries become the condition to become a lecturer in performing arts, and that the dependence on a PhD for a high position in teaching is merging things that should be separated. Epistemological purpose of research should be separated from obtaining a qualification. And as last food for thought, it is vital the articulation between education and research. Art research strengthens social cohesion. Epistemological purpose of research should be separated from obtaining a qualification. Artistic research as a practice that could not be done in any other way. And this is perhaps the key idea that Stefan left us with. I will now share with you some of the highlights of our guest lecturer, Andrea B Bright. She's a senior scientist at the University of Vienna, Department for Theatre, Film and Media Studies. And Andrea presented a lecture on artistic research and film practice. And to start with, Andrea took us back to some key important notions of the Frascati Manual, which defines R&D activities along 5 core criteria. 1, to be aimed at new findings, novel. 2nd, to be based on original, not obvious concepts and hypotheses, creative. And 3rd, to be uncertain about the final outcome, uncertain. 4th, to be planned and budget, systematic. 5th, to lead to results that could be possibly reproduced, transferable, and or reproducible. So with this background, let's see some of Andrea's ideas on this topic. We can start with the idea that if you do not hold a PhD, but you are a professor, you are able to supervise a PhD if you are a practitioner in Andrea's country. This is something that needs further debate across Europe because legislation is not consensual, and in many countries this is not possible. Then this notion that transdisciplinary research can have film at the center and not merely as an auxiliary device, so that film is not used as something that is a minor tool of research, something that is subservient to other tools. And from this, we have this notion that film can address film research just with filmic means. And this is probably a very groundbreaking idea because it entitles and empowers film practitioners. And from here, we have the perspective that in order to produce artistic research, you must be an artist and produce artistic research by your artistic means. Therefore, artistic research is a research that is done by the practitioners. They are the ones experimenting and trying to break perspectives, bring innovative knowledge in the field. And then why are these debates important? Because artistic research is important for enabling artists to continue their studies after an MA, access funding, and the first cycle of higher education studies. Otherwise would be unfair. So what we are addressing here is this notion that perhaps we need to make for a more balance assessment in terms of the validation of people that undertake theoretical research in the arts and artistic researchers, and that funding across the European Union should have strong perspectives on this to enable, to empower these practitioners and to allow them to develop in academia. So, consequently, not only artists with a PhD should be able to do artistic research, then perhaps theory shouldn't be always the key. The PhD shouldn't always be the key for research, for validated research in academia, the relevance of the experience of practitioners. Um, and then Andrea brought us this notion that intuition is as important within the arts as it is in the study of biology or maths or physics. If intuition is important in these fields of work, why it should be looked upon with suspicion when we come to arts? Intuition can be key to lead to innovative research. Then the concept that we should let the project develop freely, but then the researcher must make themselves accountable for what they have done. So the artistic research is a research that is as reliable as any other because it will be accountable for. And why? And to conclude, we need to have it quite clear that artistic research is a research that goes beyond self-reflexibility. So therefore, is a research that is accountable, it's reproducible, it comes into the line of the criteria that we first express from the Frascati manual. With Elena Rusinova, we had the opportunity to understand in detail how another organization deals with postgraduate studies. Elena Rusinova is PhD, Arts Associate Professor, Vice-Rector for Research and Science, Head of Sound Department at WGAK, Russian State Institute of Cinematography. And she started by giving us this overview of the postgraduate programs at VGAK and these different paths: the theoretical academic research, that is a 3 years program that requires teaching and research experience and the scientific background, and the practical research assistant internship, that is a 2 years program teaching and requires teaching and production experience, and a background that can be of audiovisual art sound engineer, teacher of creative disciplines in higher education, for example. We could also understand better the types of research and work that are taking place at universities of culture and art, and this notion of educational programs plus supervision. And on one side, we have this collecting knowledge and experience, practical research following by analysis, and this counterpart, investigation, new vision, theoretical research, scientific work. Following these in more detail, there are some interesting aspects to it in terms of educational programs and supervision. This notion that question, knowledge, and experience is vital, practical research following by analysis. But on this board in particular, what is also relevant is that later in the defense, it is important to, that is an investigation that provides new vision, searching, approbation, publication, presentation, and it encompasses articles, experience in conferences, and teaching project activities, being some of these optional. Further along, in terms of the description of the artistic research programs, we have the pedagogical approaches to topic, research based in artistic topics. And in terms of thesis, this concept of self-research, practicing teaching, practicing research in and publication in at least 3 journals. In terms of the entry requirements, it's necessary to propose a timeline, to be an expert specialized in a certain discipline, to have BA, MA industry experience, and to have a proposal for research. Language is important, and it is necessary that candidates are fluent in Russian. Then there are different supervision models and different models of PhD that encompass creative practice, theoretical research, and PhD by publication. And these institutions, supervisors are also appointed at the moment of enrollment. Work is pretty much self-motivated, and a particular department is responsible for the student. Additional supervision, technical creative instruction is also provided by the department. In terms of the practical research assistant internship, the 2-year program mentioned beforehand, it obeys to regulations for teachers, disciplinary specific additional training, advanced skills. It provides with teaching experience, production experience, communication training, and higher education, pedagogy, and psychology. To conclude, in terms of collecting knowledge and experience, we have creative practice, building on practice by reflection on practice, further practice, workshops, project activities, reflection on practice, written publication, thesis, journals, book chapters, and project activity allows students to consolidate and acquire creative and technical skills, independent work leading to self-organizational and production research skills. So as you can see, this was an extremely useful insight in terms of understanding how the concept of research in the field of arts operates at VGAK, the Russian State Institute of Cinematography. We will now conclude with our final guest speaker, Carl McLaughlin. And Carl is chair of film studies at Queen's University Belfast and director of the Prison's Memory Archive. He has both supervised and examined practice-based PhDs, and as such can be qualified as an expert on the UK Level 10 system. So we were privileged to have an insight in terms of these practices in the UK. If we start with creativity and originality, it is relevant to, of course, consider legitimization of creative research. Where does the creativity, originality exist? That writing allows the artist to explain the context of their research. That written reflection helps students contextualize and define their work through their own methodology and theoretical framework. And as a final idea, the fact that the originality and the creativity involved in the research is outlined and contextualized within the written ECGs. Continuing, in terms of research supervision, the expertise of the supervisors helps the student to understand where the research lies within practice. So this perspective that the supervisor's choice is paramount, that conference workshops are important tools for the skills training, and that of course the institutional research skills are essential if we consider that so many of the outputs are interdisciplinary, what can require additional training. In terms of the debated notion of new knowledge and practice-based PhD, what contexts are they working in, these students, and what knowledge are they adding? What frontier are they trying to break? What are the standards of creative outputs? Where the research lies within the practice should be articulated in the proposal and ultimately in the thesis. What originality is the candidate aiming to bring? And as an idea that is key, the fact that we are considering here is extending and not creating new knowledge, perhaps. So, in terms of the process, the creative practice and writing tend to happen simultaneously. Year one research, year two production, research projects. You have research within the practice, practice research as an output, and if we focus in film in terms of research outputs, of course, research on film content, research on technology on form, film process is the research practice, filmmaking as an assumed research output. At this stage, in terms of the contemporary debate, there are key questions, and we can have a perspective of the AV PhD Supervisors and Examiners Forum. What are the rules and regulations for these practice-based PhDs? What all the students produce at an upgrade? When should they transfer from MPhil to PhD? How should the practice and written thesis relate? Should the practice be seen first? Should there be two vivas, one for the practice, one for the theory? How professional should the practice be? Who is qualified to examine? What are the practical, financial, and institutional barriers? So as we can see, these are essential questions. Um, in terms of the details of the written thesis, the word count, it tends to be decided by the institution, and in the UK is roughly 40 to 50,000 words. In terms of the creative output, can be anything, but needs to be justified by the candidate. Writing allows students to draw out and reflect on their practice. Continue here in terms of the expectation on examiners. Of course, these practice-based PhDs tend to have overlapping interdisciplinary topics. And it's key and essential to understand how these, where these overlaps occur, and that examiners need to have empathy towards the research and understand the interdisciplinary nature of it. So the formation of examiners at this stage is essential and something that needs to be addressed to in terms of the assessment. Important question when assessing creative practice and written, judging and weighting of each and quality. Most work that is produced is expected to have public broadcast, installation, cinematic release. However, you always have to come back to the standards that the students set for themselves. Expectations of publication, both in writing and practice, should be published or publishable within the context of the research. When a student writes their introductory chapter, they set out the standard that they are trying to achieve, and that's what I judge them on. And these were uh, Cole McLuhan's perspectives on the topic, and we were fortunate enough to have this bird's eye view perspective on the topic. This was a succinct overview of contemporary discussion on the topic of artistic research. and the opportunities and challenges it entails. FilmEU will endeavor to keep steering the debate sketched in this video presentation.